everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. At least I'm your host for this first introduction, because today's a celebration of Attendance Bias. This has been 1 year, August 11th, 1 year since the show debuted on Apple Podcasts. The show actually premiered a few days earlier than that, but since Apple Podcasts makes up somewhere around 75% of the podcast downloads, I consider the day it appeared on that outlet its 1 year anniversary. So it's been a full year of episodes. I'd like to thank you so much for listening. In celebration of this 1 year anniversary, I thought it would be fun to have a guest host so I could take a break and be the guest, and we were lucky enough to be able to have previous Attendance Bias guest, Justin Bruce, to be the guest host today. Justin previously appeared on an episode to talk about July 7th, 2000 in Burgettstown. As a favor to me and to the podcast as a whole, Justin decided to come on and not ask me about an Attendance Bias show or a jam, but really to just kind of give some background information about myself, who I am as a person, as a music fan, and of course, as a Phish fan and as a podcaster. So today, you're not going to hear about a specific show, but you'll probably hear about 7 or 8 different shows, as well as different bands, different types of music, and get a look behind the curtain at what makes Attendance Bias happen. So sit back, relax, and enjoy today's episode as a guest host of Justin Bruce and your guest, Brian Weinstein, for today. Justin, thank you for being today's guest host on Attendance Bias. It's nice to get a break for once.
Yeah, Brian, you need to sit back, relax, let someone else do the heavy lifting. Although hopefully I have come up with some questions that'll help your audience, get to know you a little more. I feel like we all know you a lot because we listen a lot, but I had questions, so I've come armed with them.
Well, I hope that I have answers.
Well,
that satisfy you.
We will find out, but of course it goes without saying, big fan of the podcast, love hearing, everyone's attendance bias stories, which is just such a great concept for a podcast since we all know about attendance bias, but it's nice actually hearing about it from folks. I figured let's go back to the beginning. I mean, we know you're a big music fan, but how did that sort of love for music germinate? Where did you grow up? Can you take us back to young Brian?
First, I've said this a number of times, but I grew up on the South Shore of Long Island in a town called Merrick, which is just outside New York City, about 45 minutes drive without traffic. And my first memories of music is being in the back seat of my mom and dad's car. They had a Pontiac and a Chevy. And I remember when I would be in the back seat, we listened to one of 2 radio stations. We would listen to either CBS FM, which is the oldie station in New York. So pretty much up to 1960 probably. And that was it. And my dad would always put that on when he was driving. So stuff like Don't Know Much About Biology, The Temptations, songs like that are just easily earworms that no matter how old or young you are, they get immediately hooked into your brain and they're still there. So that's the oldest memory. And then when my mom was driving, we would put on WPLJ, which is 95.5, which is kind of like top 40 radio, but like PG top 40 radio, like somewhere between easy listening and pop. So like Human League would be on there. Billy Joel would be on there, like safe for kids sort of music, as opposed to more cutting edge, like top 40 stuff.
Right. And this is like late 80s, these early memories, mid 80s?
Mid 80s, I would say. I was born in 1982. So my earliest memories are probably around 86 or so, like Uptown Girl, because I lived on Long Island. So Billy Joel was just everywhere all the time.
Right. So the whole Madison Square Garden Phish versus Billy Joel thing, you kind of find yourself in a pickle?
No, not even in a pickle, because I love them both. And I don't, anyone who has something against Billy Joel, that's totally fine taste-wise, but I think he's the greatest also. Wow. I'm not in a pickle.
Well, and one thing I do know about you, because you've mentioned it on the podcast, is that you are a big Who fan. Was that like a fandom that germinated as well in the backseat of that Pontiac or that Chevrolet?
No, that came a little bit later, around 1993. So I was about 10 years old. Actually, side story, talking about Billy Joel, that was when he was on his River of Dreams tour in 1993. And I remember my cousin stayed up all night at the Madison Square Garden box office to get tickets for my whole family, like 8 of us.
Sounds safe.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the time, it may have been, it was a time when you could bring a sleeping bag or just lean against a wall and wait all night for concert tickets early the next morning. And he got tickets for about 8 of us to go see the River of Dreams tour. And at the end, Billy Joel always closes with Piano Man, or he used to. Now it might be Scenes from an Italian Restaurant. But at the end of Piano Man, the whole band drops out and the whole crowd just sings the chorus because it's like the greatest single-one chorus ever. And I remember my parents or my mom leaning over to me because, as we all know, Madison Square Garden is right above Penn Station. And if you want to make a train, you got to leave a little bit before to give yourself time to get there. And she leaned over to me and said, "We could leave now and we'll make the train. But if we don't leave now and we stay for the rest of the concert, we'll have to wait at the train station. What do you want to do?" And it was in the middle of Piano Man. I remember turning to her and yelling, "You could go, but I'm staying." And I'm 10 years old.
Right.
So that was like the beginning of my love of live music. And then right around that same time for The Who, Tommy went on Broadway. And my aunt had the Broadway cast recording. And I heard Pinball Wizard like somewhere, maybe around her house or maybe on the radio. And I was so obsessed with that flamenco guitar opening that Pete Townsend plays with that amazing power chord that comes in over like the midway point.
Mm-hmm.
Something about that really, really spoke to me. So I borrowed the CD. It was a double CD from my aunt. And that just, my life could be divided to before Who and after Who.
And that's pretty amazing because, as Phish fans, we're obviously enthusiastic and pretty serious about our music. When I think of The Who, I actually have some similar memories because you and I are not that far apart age-wise. I remember, The Who going to Broadway in the early 90s and that music kind of making a resurgence. But when I think of The Who, I think of like Pearl Jam and Eddie Vedder because he cited them as such an influence. And there's certainly some crossover, of course, in the Phish community. But for whatever reason, when you say, yeah, I love The Who and I love Billy Joel, that to me says like, this is a guy who likes what he likes, and he is not going to be pinned into any one particular neighborhood musically. And I like, and I hope this doesn't come across as like a snooty indie, like pitchforky kind of way, but like that's something that I really admire. You're not going on and on about the latest this or the latest that. You can and you do, but you also have these classic rock kind of origins from the 80s because you're a child of the 80s, just like I am.
And it's fun because I don't even see that big of a difference between them because before Tommy and even within Tommy, The Who were a pop band. Pete Townsend wanted to write big, successful pop music like the Beatles, or his first influence, I think, was the Kinks, which is why there's so much short rhythm guitar in their early songs. When they released I Can See for Miles, and it didn't do as well, I think it reached like number 8 in the UK charts, he was hugely disappointed because he saw himself as like as good a songwriter as Lennon, McCartney, or as Ray Davies, or Jagger and Richards, as any other British Invasion power duo you could name. And he wanted to be a pop star. And then, of course, he became a huge concept album megalomaniac. It's, Psycho who had a nervous breakdown. But Billy Joel is arguably the pop artist of the late 70s and 80s. So I didn't even see that much separation between them as a listener because you could sing both their melodies when you're done listening.
Yeah, I totally see that for sure. I mean, infectious songs are infectious songs, whether, we're talking about classic Phish tunes from the late 80s and the early and the mid 90s, or Billy Joel from earlier on. So speaking of Phish, I mean, you grew up in the Northeast. I feel like your proximity to New York City and New England almost gives you like a head start into Phish fandom. How early did it happen for you, and how did it come to be for you?
I've mentioned this a few times on the show, but basically, and this probably won't surprise anybody, I went to a summer camp in Massachusetts starting in I think it was 1990 was my first year going. I was 8 years old or 7 because my birthday is late in the year and it was during the summer. I'm a type 1 diabetic, and there is a summer camp. There's several, but this one is in a town called Charlton, Massachusetts. It's kind of Western Mass, a little southwest of Worcester, I think. And it's specifically for children with diabetes, where it's a regular summer camp with like baseball, and they had their own little radio station and a soccer pavilion or a hockey pavilion and tennis courts, like any other summer camp. but also they would also teach you how to manage your diabetes, how to measure out meals and how to count carbohydrates and read labels and measure insulin. And so it was kind of a mesh between those two. And that is a big part of my upbringing and my life. So fast forward, I'm probably about 14 years old, maybe 13. And we're going on a field trip from camp from Massachusetts to Mount Washington in New Hampshire, the White Mountains. Mm-hmm. And it's like a 4-hour drive. It's a long van ride. I was with the older kids. I didn't know a lot of them. So I brought my Discman and I brought Live at Leeds. After I finished listening to Live at Leeds, I figured, all right, might as well take these headphones off and be a little social. And the driver, the counselor who was driving, put on a picture of Nectar. And I liked it. I was listening. I wasn't really paying attention. And then once Glide came on, that did it. That was it. And it was all over. I wasn't going to ask him because I was too shy, but I wanted him to play it over and over and over again. And then after Glide, I don't remember the track listing, but between Llama and Stash and Glide and Tweezer Reprise and like this murderer's row of amazing Phish songs, I asked him who it was. I asked him to tell me about it. And I spent the rest of that summer listening to A Picture of Nectar. The day after I got home from camp, I went to Sam Goody in the Roosevelt Field Mall and I bought it. It was an expensive CD. It was $17.99, I remember, because it's a long, I know, because it's a long album. It's like 17 tracks. And it was just, that became the soundtrack for the rest of my life. Pretty much. So it was Glide that did it.
Isn't that crazy? I was thinking that recently because for me, and I'm sure these were, what year about was that? Can you figure that out?
That was probably summer of 96, I would guess.
Yeah. You and I are kind of right in that same territory because for me, I just happened to copy a bunch of CDs and copied a live one from a friend, and that was the soundtrack to, I guess, what was then like sophomore year of high school, maybe 96, maybe it was 97. But ever since then, I think, wow, I'm still really into it. Here we are, 20 plus years later. So that's great. Not to go off script, but I have to ask, I didn't remember the type 1 diabetes information. Mm-hmm. Does that impact, obviously, maybe how you're seeing shows even now, as a grown up here?
Yeah, in a way it does. And I'll try to keep this short because I could go about it forever. But the short answer is yes, because as a diabetic, I always have like questions and checks in my head to make sure I'm prepared for pretty much any given situation. So I've, since maybe 2012 or 2015, I've stopped pretty much doing anything extracurriculars pretty much at shows, maybe a beer or two.
Right.
I have to bring some medications in. I have to bring, I have an insulin pump attached to my belt clip, and that always causes questions and delays at entrances. Sometimes I got to bring in like little snacks, like fruit snacks or little candies to make sure that in case my blood sugar does drop, I have something immediate and accessible. And I always got to plan ahead. I always got to make sure, do I have something to eat once we get out of the show? Do I buy a Coke just for insurance? Just to have it with me. So yeah, I always got to think ahead. Am I going to eat before the show? If so, where? If so, when? How far is it to the venue? Do I have everything I need? If something fails, do I have a replacement? It's this constant checklist, which was why Mexico was the greatest gift in the world, because everything was right in front of me and I didn't have to worry about anything. There was no anxiety about my health at all.
Yeah. And I guess on account of, your condition that you've kind of got to be the one in charge in your crew or in your, little clique of fans. You're definitely keeping it together because, medically you've got to keep it together. You can't be getting too out of hand. So I'm sure your posse appreciates that. You're always the level-headed one.
I'm always the driver. I'm always driving home.
You are priceless. Well, speaking of, Brian as a Phish show going fan, we think because it covers, decades now of ourselves in our early fandom and the band has stayed with us. Obviously, we're doing a Phish podcast here through our adult lives. How have you transformed as a Phish fan? 1.0 seems like eons ago. 2.0 seems like eons ago. And gosh, even parts of 3.0 are, way in the distant memory. 4.0, I don't care what we call it, honestly, but walk me through your evolution as a fan.
Yeah, just as parents say that when their kids get older, it's like, oh, it was just yesterday that you were in my lap. I feel that way about the early 3.0. Like to me, Hampton was yesterday, the Hampton comeback. When I hear it's 2021. So when a show from 2011 comes up, it really doesn't seem so far ago, but it's been a decade, since Bethel, for example, or the Steam New Year's encore, the New Year's gag. I couldn't stop to think about it too much because I'll have a breakdown.
Right. And honestly, then you go back to I'm sure some of your first shows, because you saw shows back in 1.0 and you think, golly, this seems like literally ages ago. I don't know about you, but my memories are hazy. And that's just due to the passage of time, not even, with respect to anything else.
Well, my memories of 1.0 are actually better than a lot of 3.0 because, and I'll get into this probably a little later, but Phish has been so much more accessible and easy in 3.0 than they were in 1.0. Whereas, so 1.0, every show was really precious, and they still are, but it was basically a honeymoon period. Now that I look back at it, everything was perfect because it was also starting in the late 90s, which I didn't develop a very big taste for, but I know others have.
Right. There's some heady fans out there who really appreciate the late 90s.
Yeah, maybe one or two. But but it also coincided musically with the crest of the band's career because it led up to Big Cypress. My first show was the New Year's run of 1997. It was December 29th.
Incredible.
Yeah, which is, and if you want to talk about attendance bias, that is my number one answer. I happen to believe it's the best 2-set show the band has ever played, which is a big conversation to have at any point. So I would see them that night, and then I didn't see them again until the New Year's run of 98 because I didn't have a car. I was only 15. My parents wouldn't trust me to get in a stranger's car or an older kid's car. Or once in 99 to Hartford, I took a train to Hartford from Penn Station because none of us had our licenses yet.
Wow. And that is so incredible. I mean, my first show, you got into it even earlier than I did. I was 18, and I'm still surprised as a recent high school graduate that my parents let me and a handful of other high school 18-year-old friends drive 4 hours west to go to Pittsburgh and Star Lake and Burgettstown. As a parent myself now, I'm trying to fast forward to when my little kids are 18, and I'm thinking, maybe I'll tag along here just to keep an eye on things. Kudos to your parents for granting you a little bit of freedom there.
Yeah, I think about that occasionally. My birthday's in October, and these shows were in December 29th. So I was 15 for exactly 2 months. But I'm not a parent, and I'm a middle school teacher. So I teach 12 and 13-year-olds. As a parent, letting your 15-year-old get on a 45-minute train ride to New York City and go to a Phish concert, no less. It wasn't Billy Joel.
Yeah.
Which is, stainless steel clean. Nothing could go wrong there.
Sure.
But they let me go to concerts at a pretty young age. I remember when I was 13 going to see Stone Temple Pilots and the Meat Puppets at Jones Beach.
Wow.
With my friend Tim, who was 1 year older than me. He was 14.
That's pretty cool. And I mean, in retrospect, how awesome to grow up so close to, the nexus of live music in New York City. What a blessing that was.
Everyone came through New York. Still does. But yeah, so 2.0, after 1.0, I was in college and just getting out of college. To start, I was a little bitter that the band decided to take their break, their hiatus, right when it was the time where you, in my head, didn't need to be responsible for anything. You had a car, you didn't have to explain anything to anyone. I was a good student, so I wanted to be back wherever in time of class, but it wasn't a sin to skip a couple classes to see Phish. Mm-hmm. And so they were gone for my freshman and sophomore year of college. And that was very disappointing. And they came back for their, I didn't get tickets for that New Year's 2002 show at MSG, but I got tickets for the Cincinnati run, February 21st and 22nd, 2003. And I was so excited to see them, but I was already more jaded than I was in 1.0, because I remember when they released Walls of the Cave on America Online, AOL, first listen, with this weird embedded media player that took forever to load. And I listened to it with my roommate, and I immediately did not like Walls of the Cave. Right away.
How do you feel about it now?
It's usually the set one closer, so I'll get a head start on the bathrooms.
I do prefer Pebbles and Marbles about twice as much as Walls of the Cave. I don't know if that's overexposure. And I don't know about you, but between 1.0 and 2.0, I was also in college, and all of a sudden I have access to high-speed internet, and I figured out downloading shows. I was not quite hip enough to get in on blanks and postage. So for me, the time between 1.0 and 2.0, my Phish fandom went from, being serious to being like pretty significant, because there was like a rabbit hole that I could jump down, and I actually had the means of jumping down. So I would imagine for you, as well as for me, there was, maybe like a lot of pressure when you were seeing some of those shows. And of course the playing, sometimes in 2.0, you'd be crossing your fingers that they, nailed David Bowie or whatever it was. But it was like an era of expectations. I think, at least that's my recollection.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And like an era of expectation. I think that's definitely fair, because during that late 1.0 period, once I got into them, I was in. When you talk about going down a rabbit hole, that was pretty much my whole high school experience. Whenever I wasn't doing one thing, I was into Phish. That was what else. That was always either number one or number two on my priority list. And it didn't let up. It kind of still hasn't, in a way. But you're right about that era of expectation, where 2003 was outstanding. And a lot of people lumped together 2.0 with 2004 as if 2.0 was a huge mess, like as a whole. And it isn't. 2003 is as good as pretty much any other tour you can mention, especially that February tour. And I loved the road trips, like from Buffalo to Cincinnati is a long trip. It's like 7 hours, I think, especially in February. Yeah. And, it got pretty nasty at some points. And like, I have these cherished memories, that, and then of course, and going down to Camden without a second thought. Whereas now it's like, oh, well, what day of the week is it? What do I have going on? Is there someone to watch the dog? Then it was like, oh, they're playing within an 8-hour radius. We have to go.
Yeah.
So 2.0 was a big feeling. It was a big time of adventure for me, and was kind of fulfilling those fantasies that I read about in the Phish Compendium and the Farmer's Almanac of everyone hop into the car and just take off. We'll figure it out later. So for me, that was 2.0, because I didn't have those resources, or I don't know, or know-how in 1.0. I was too young. But then by 2004, I went more out of habit than out of anything else, because the music wasn't good to me. I did not like a lot of what they played in 2004.
Yeah, I mean, I live in Las Vegas now, but my first trip ever to Las Vegas was back in 2004 to those April shows. That was my first time really traveling, like getting on a plane to go see Phish and really making a big adventure out of it. And I mean, I'm sure I had a great time, but yeah, the letdowns were there in 2.0, obviously. How did you spend the time between 2.0 and 3.0? Because if anything, I found that my level of enthusiasm for Phish maybe just continued to grow in that 5-year little hiatus or breakup, because of course we didn't know that they were going to come back. How was it for you?
I actually had kind of the opposite reaction, that I was very much at peace with the fact that Phish was broken up and wasn't coming back, because I had the distinct thought, I think it was at the first night of Great Woods, I think it was August 10th, 2004, that if this is how they're going to play, it's better that they're breaking up. Like, I'm okay with them. I like that there's context. I like that there's an ending to this story now, rather than this open-ended story of Trey staring into space with messed up hair, looking to nowhere, playing with his pedals, which is what I was paying about $70 a night to see out of habit and almost a sense of obligation, which is not fun. And the crowd was gross. I remember going to, and I'll probably get a lot of shit for saying this, but Saratoga, those legendary Saratoga shows in 2004, I had a terrible time. It was so oversold, and it was just, felt so overwhelmed and upset. So during that time in between 2004 and 2009, Phish was all right to take the back seat. I was kind of done with them for a little while. And it was also kind of a golden age of second tier jam band music. You know, it was especially in New York City post college.
Yeah. I mean, again, you found yourself literally, you know, in the nexus of the music universe and the jam band scene. I was, by that point in time, living in Nashville, and I thought nothing with my mid-20s freedom and lack of responsibilities of hopping in the car and driving the 4 to 5 hours to Atlanta to see, like, you know, Mike play with the Duo, or, you know, going down to Birmingham to randomly see String Cheese Incident. My appetite for live music was high. It was just trying to figure out ways to satisfy that. That was a little bit of a challenge at times. How did you feel as we talk about 3.0 then, when they did come back? Because did you have some hesitation? Did you have like a little bit of tentativeness, or were you confident that, you know, the problems of 2.0 had been addressed and had been healed, and maybe things were on the up and up in 2009?
By then, I didn't care. That was the greatest day of my life. October 1st, 2008 was when they announced it on Phish.com with the time-lapse sketch of Hampton. That was their time-lapse video to announce it. My girlfriend at the time, she told me that I screamed like a little girl. She was in the kitchen and I was in the other room. And she said she'll never forget my reaction, not knowing what I was looking at. I remember leading up to it that there were these like breadcrumbs that they got together at someone's wedding. I think it might have been Brad Sands. I'm probably getting that wrong, but that they played Susie Greenberg at someone's wedding. And Trey, in a Rolling Stone interview said that he would give his left nut to play You Enjoy Myself every day. And so every single bit of media was causing huge waves in, I think this is when I discovered PT, you know, Fantasy Tour.
Oh, yeah.
And everything, just like it is now, was broken down for meaning. And it's like, it's going to happen any day. It's going to happen. So I was, even though I was a little bit over Phish in 2004, when Coventry was over, I was ready to throw my life out the window. I remember a conversation with my girlfriend at the time. We were just getting started to be in a serious relationship. We were in the kitchen doing something for dinner, and I'll never forget this conversation. She said to me that this summer, I don't remember when the year it was, but she said, this summer, my dad is turning 60, and I think he wants to rent out a bunch of condos in Stowe, Vermont. They had quite ample means in Stowe, Vermont, and bring the whole family up for like a week-long vacation for his birthday and just for fun. And I said, great, cool. But just so you know, if Phish ever announces that they're getting back together, I'm going to drop everything, and I'm going to that. So this was well before they announced anything. This was like,
I'm like, just covering your bases.
Yes. It's like, there's an asterisk next to every plan we ever make for the rest of our lives. And so that was set. I was ready for them to come back, and hearing Trey going through drug court, and I know that Mike and Paige and Fishman, they did their here and there sort of side projects, but I had no doubt that they had it together. But as goes Trey, so goes Phish. So if he was ready to go, I was ready to go.
And it was pretty wild. I remember also being so excited. Although to me, and I only bring this up because I'm curious about your reactions, the first handful of shows that I saw, and I didn't go to Hampton in 2009, but I did hit up 4 or 5 shows in that summer tour. And I just had built the band up so much in the breakup, and discovered sort of all of the big tentpole jams of 1.0 and 2.0 that, of course, they were getting their sea legs during 2009. And as we'd come to find out for the next couple of years. And it was a little bit of a combination of being maybe slightly let down with the actual music, but also I was engaged. I was buying a house for the first time, making plans to get married. The rest of life just kind of took over during that time of early 3.0. So I ended up taking a little bit of time off. What was your reaction to 3.0? Were you 100% from the get-go?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. This was the first time I had just started a teaching job, a full-time teaching tenure track job. And so this was the first time that I had a full professional's master's degree salary in New York and on Long Island in particular. The pay scale is pretty good for teachers. And I also had summers off and a pretty generous vacation schedule otherwise. Teaching is extremely difficult, but whenever people say, "Oh, you like those summers off?" the answer is, "Yeah, fuck you, I sure do." Yeah, it's a gift from God.
Yeah,
And
I'm jealous.
But yeah, I was 100% in. So 2009, you're right about these expectations. So it shared that with 2.0 in terms of coming back, and everyone wants it to be ready from the get-go, playing these 40-minute tweezers as if it was 1995 again.
Right.
And that obviously didn't happen. But to me, the big joy of it was they were playing these songs that they were kind of scared to play in 2.0. And so the more shows you went to, the more songs you saw that if you got into them around the time I did in the late 90s, you probably would never see. They stopped playing Mound for the most part in 2.0. I know that's not entirely true, but for the most part, they didn't play Fluffhead at all in 2.0.
And it's kind of nice to have, your professional life in order so you could kind of have fun and with a lot of summers off and a little bit of coin in your pocket. Yeah, those must have been glory days in early 3.0.
And there were hints that they were still there in terms of, you mentioned getting their sea legs, like their full potential. Like I remember, or Thanksgiving weekend when they played Albany, they played that 7 Below into Ghost, or Ghost into 7 Below. And that was, I remember everyone's standing at Phish, but it was really a standing ovation after that jam. And that's the missing piece of the puzzle. They played good jams before that. I remember, I think it was June 7th, early in the tour in Camden, I think they played a really good Sand. And so they were like poking holes in this like dress rehearsal feeling or this recital feeling that I think is what Hampton felt like to me. And it seemed like behind the curtain, jammy Phish is still there. And they're just coming out every once in a while, like a person recovering from dementia, where it's like they know where they are for 10 minutes at a time. I'm like, well, whenever you're there, I'm here. Whenever you decide to come back, and I know it's not decide, but whenever your full jamming self comes back, I'm here waiting for you.
What year did you feel like, all right, hell yeah, like we're at where I was kind of hoping the band would be? Could you identify a year in 3.0 where that maybe switch kind of officially flipped in your brain?
It's funny. So I'm a Libra, so I never have a single answer for everything. I always have to balance out my first answer with the second. So at the time, it was like every show they were back, and that was all that mattered.
Right.
So I didn't give a shit. Like it was, they're here on Hampton, and they played like 30 songs in one show, and none of them had a real jam. Who cares? It's Phish, and we went 5 years without them. In retrospect, though, I think maybe 2010. When they played Waiting for Columbus and they played that Zeppelin show the night before. Because to me, that's Phish that I know. That's goofy Phish with a fun gag that they pull off musically. It felt like a huge party, and it holds up to repeat listens. To me, that's what Phish means, generally. And then on Halloween, I was already a big Little Feat fan, but a lot of people around me had no idea what they were about to hear when they saw the Waiting for Columbus Phish bill. So I was very excited, and it might be the least of their 3.0 Halloween costumes, either that or I would say Exile on Main Street or maybe David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust. But to me, like it was a double album that they covered, which is kind of in line with 1.0. They had a, I forget his name, maybe Giovanni Hidalgo, that percussion player. So they had guests on there. And to me, that's like all the stuff I love about Phish from tapes, like all the stuff that I had to picture in my mind's eye. I was seeing it now in live and in person. So to me, that's when it felt like they were back as the band that I knew and hoped for.
Well, let's talk a little more specifically about the band. Is your favorite member Trey? If you had to pick a favorite member,
I think it's Fishman.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because I play the drums, and so
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, I'm like a recovering drummer. I'll put it that way. So I'm not like an active drummer, but I've made a lot of connections over playing music for most of my life. So I'll get a text every once in a while, like, "Hey, my friends and I are jamming. We're renting out a space. Are you free tonight?" And I'm in. Or I'll go to these open mic jams that are in bars around here where it's guys who are twice my age. They still call me a kid, and I'm almost 40. But you go there with a pair of drumsticks, and it's pretty much karaoke with a live band. If they know the song and you know the song, you get up on stage and play. Mm-hmm. But that's why Fishman, I think, is my favorite, because he's so versatile and he's so steady. I feel like you could always count on Fishman.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't worried about Fishman when I was seeing those Vegas shows in April of 2004. That's for sure. I'm with you. I mean, what percentage, random question, I'm just making up, what percentage of Phish fans do you think would cite Trey as their favorite member? Do you think it's like
80%?
Okay. Yeah. I was thinking like 75, 80%. So that tracks. Although I don't play the drums, love listening to Fishman, and all other things being equal, I'm always trying with my ears to keep an eye on, or keep an ear on, what Fishman is doing, because people don't realize, and it happens in subtle ways, how he can sort of steer and cause jams to pick up the pace, obviously, but also, he can usually inject some energy in a jam. And when there are big, long 20, 30-minute jams that naturally have inflection points at the heart of those like twists and turns, he's usually a pretty important player.
Yeah, and he's very instinctual. I think Trey is more of an ADD kind of student, where he'll throw everything at the wall and see what sticks and then go in the direction that he thought was most successful. Fishman is, for his speed of playing, is a lot more patient, where he'll wait and he'll float there, keep on doing what he's doing. And then once he hears an opportunity, an opening, then he'll go all in. Like he'll think about before he acts. Whereas I think that Trey just acts and then catches up with whatever he thinks works. I think Fishman does the opposite.
Well, it turns out they're all really good, because love listening to Trey, love listening to Phish. My sneaky pick for favorite band member is actually Mike, just because I love how, melodically he plays. And once he got sort of turned up in the mix, he just adds so much that I feel like most sort of rock bands, you wouldn't think, oh, the bass player is one of the most interesting ingredients in this band, but
or the weirdest.
Well, he's got that on lockdown for sure.
Yeah.
We sort of talked about, old tunes that you loved, with a picture of Nectar being Glide. And were you at Coventry? You were, weren't you? So how was that, Glide wise? As
I've said on the show, I'm very big into stats. I love checking my stats, especially when I was a newer fan. And it was such a joy to talk to Zizix. It was
a great episode.
Thank you. That was like a dream come true, to talk to this person who I spent hours on his website just for like an analytical introspection. And so I always wanted to hear Glide live. And it was like a monkey's paw kind of story when they played it at Coventry, where it's like, all right, you'll hear it, but it's going to be the single worst song that Phish has ever performed. So I excluded that. After Coventry was over, I would convince myself that I still hadn't heard Glide.
Yeah. That's an interesting, and I I could see the logic inherent in that. What about a new song from the last couple of albums, or the last handful of years that you like irrationally, and not like just a great new song, but like something that hits you maybe more than the average fan?
I love Page's song, I Always Wanted It This Way, or as I Always Wanted It That Way. I don't even know. But that song, whenever they start it and fans start making beelines for the bathroom to get a beer, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here from front to back. I want to hear every note that they play on that song.
I love how it starts like with the synthesizers, and there's just kind of layers, and it's almost like a frenetic kind of excitement to that song.
Well, it's also, you mentioned Mike playing very melodically. In that song, his bass mirrors the synthesizer. It's like do 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 do, and it's very planted. It's almost like a Tony Markellis bass line, where it's the same thing until it isn't, like forever and ever. There have been so many good versions of it, and I still don't think they fully cracked it open yet.
I'm going to take this chance to make you jealous. The one time I got to go to a sound check and meet Trey, I didn't get to meet the other members of the band, but I was sitting there with Don Hart in Nashville in 2016, and they spent most of that sound check on night 2 working on I Always Wanted It This Way. So it was a few more nights until they actually played it again. But yeah, talking about, I think, fall 2016, because I was the same way back then. I was like, they need to play this a little bit more. And so, yeah, that's funny to hear you say that. What about an old song that you're not a huge fan of? And like an example of this to me would be like Scent of a Mule, or, just because it is catchy, and in the moment you're like, all right, cool. But it always, for me, listening back to some of those old like Summer 95 shows, you're just like, okay, all right, I know what's going on for the next like 10 minutes or so of this set. What about you?
Well, with Scent of a Mule, just real quick, I hear what you're saying there. If I had to advocate for it, especially those 1995 versions, the speed in the Mule duel in the middle, I can never skip past that. That was a huge part of what brought me in. But my opinion, I could leave Esther for the rest of my Phish going life and not miss a thing.
That's an incorrect answer. I regret to inform you. You will receive no credit for that answer. But, I get it. It is a little hokey. I mean, at the onset with the keyboards that sound like a calliope with a creepy old fair and a carnival coming to town. But I don't know, give me all the soaring, like Trey sustain, late 80s, early 90s kind of guitar tone. So
by the time they get to that, I'm already out. Like, I don't care for the story. It's a lot of dream imagery, which I don't love as much as the nonsense, weirdly, in other early Phish songs. I just don't care for it.
All right. Well, if you and I ever catch a show with each other and they bust out Esther, we'll have some different reactions.
I'll get you a beer for Esther. Okay, you get me a beer when they play Glide.
Perfect. Sounds good. Well, let's talk a little bit more about some of their newer material. How did you feel about Big Boat? I want to ask you this. I'm popping this question on you as a surprise. And then how did you feel about the more recent album that came out at the beginning of pandemic? I'm having a brain fart right
Sigma
now.
Oasis.
Oh, yeah, that one.
Big Boat, uneven. I thought it was uneven at best as an album. And as a collection of songs, which I guess that's what an album is. But but I thought like a song like Home, for example, sounded better on record than it came out live, or Waking Up Dead, which still doesn't really latch on to anything. I don't think Mike has a lot of authority playing it or singing it, really. So I did love very much Petrichor. I thought that was what Time Turns Elastic was intended to be, in a weird way. Like, I think it's this big orchestral reaching for the heavens sort of piece that Trey conducts, basically, but it's much more attainable and able to be performed in kind of a 4-person rock setting, where Time Turns Elastic, you probably do need a full orchestra to have it reach its full peak. Well,
since you're so close to New York City, did you happen to see the New Year's Eve show with the rain and the umbrellas?
Yeah, nice, and that was outstanding. I thought that was art. Like that really is like 3.0 Phish at its best in terms of performance and performance value when it comes to New Year's Eve gags. Cause I've seen 10 in a row at this point. I never missed a New
Nice.
Year's run. And that was one of the tops. Although the set that came after it is really what makes me think that Big Boat is uneven. Because they
Now,
played a lot of Big Boat songs after that
yeah.
with a like small string section, and it wasn't
Oh,
exciting. It didn't hold up any energy.
yeah. I liked a lot of Big Boat, but the songs that I wasn't a huge fan of, like really, really did drag that down. Like Breath and Burning, maybe if they played it 3 times as fast as it ended up on the album, like then maybe we might have something. You mentioned your first show, 12/29/97, which is just a beastly accomplishment. I hope you have that on your LinkedIn profile somewhere as a teacher, even though it's not applicable. But what are some jams that you're a big fan of, maybe that other people be like, oh, yeah, I remember that one, I think.
It's hard. My first mini episodes on the podcast were about this exact thing, where every other episode was an interview with someone. But when I got started, I tried to answer this question basically by touching on specific jams that meant something to me and for what reason. And some of the ones that really stuck out to me were, you mentioned Nashville just before, the Weekapaw groove from that show, that kind of
Mhm.
heavy metal, amazing, slowed down half speed Weekapaw groove. And that show has a lot of significance to me emotionally and personally. I also mentioned Cincinnati from 2003. There's a 2001 that was played on February 21st. And again, that signaled to me that Phish was back, not 3.0, but 2.0. That there was, the intro was really extended. It had, I don't know how to pronounce it, Jesu or Jesu Ode of Joy, something like that, some Bach
Yeah.
piece that Trey was playing over the introduction. And it was a perfect, I think it was mid-set kind of come down, but still very exciting. So the 2001 from February 21st, 2003, and definitely the Weekapaug Groove from, I think it's August 4th, 2015 in Nashville.
Yeah. And of course, that's the infamous or the famous, first, second jam in a long time.
And I've gotten some guff on that one that I don't know what a second jam is, or, I'm not a real fan, that sort of stuff.
That's a nice thing about
I just repeat
having
what I
such
see on the
intense
internet,
fans. Hey, I didn't write this in our notes, so feel free to say pass.
Okay.
But having listened to your podcast, many times over, I've heard you reference, going to Nashville, and kind of that was after your divorce. And without getting like super specific and super personal, I mean, it must have been some sort of calming presence to have this love of Phish that literally carried from your childhood right on through adulthood as these other trials and tribulations were happening. Do you have any more thoughts to talk about with respect to that idea?
Well, they've always been there for me, since I was 14, like since I was getting out of middle school, basically, Phish has been there. Even if they've not been actively touring, whether it was during the hiatus or the breakup, and this podcast has kind of turned me on to this idea that you're never going to get to the bottom of it. You're never going to finish. You're never going to say, all right, I've heard all the Phish I need to hear. There's always more, because I'll hear back from people who on social media or on forums, oh, how come you never heard this show? You never heard this jam? What's wrong with you?
Right.
And it's just, there's just so much out there. It's so dense. So it's like Inception, where no matter if you're in a dream or if you're awake or who knows, there's this constant that's going to keep you aware and settled. And for me, that's been Phish, because after my divorce, which was in the spring of 2015, and I made crazy plans for that summer. Like I went to Fare Thee Well on a whim, basically. I went to Nashville by myself. I went to Merriweather Post. What else? The Man that summer, and then up to Magma Ball. And I just went all over the place to see them. And it was just refreshing. And when I sat down at that Nashville show, I was by myself. A friend was coming to meet me in a little bit, but I sat down next to this guy and started a conversation. And he asked me, how you doing? What's been going on? And when I told him this is, I'm treating myself to this night as my divorce. And when he heard that I was divorced, he went, oh, congratulations. And it was such a different reaction, because everyone I knew was like, oh, I'm sorry. Do you have kids?
Right.
Like that was everyone's reaction. So to hear someone go, oh, congrats, like this is going to be fun, right? It just, it vindicated every way that I was feeling and wanted to feel. And the Weekapaug was such an unexpected jam. That's what made it even more special.
Now, one thing that I am jealous of, because I mentioned I didn't see my first show till I was 18. For me, that was 1999. Back in 1997 in December at MSG, I mean, you were a whippersnapper. I can't think if I, get to my seats at Madison Square Garden for the New Year's run, and I'm sitting next to like a 14 or a 15-year-old kid from Long Island. Can you talk more about your first show? Because that still stacks up really highly for you, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I still think it's the best show I've seen, even if I wasn't fully aware of what I was seeing at the time. I had never seen anything like it. To me, a big takeaway from it culturally was everyone is friendlier here than anywhere else I'd ever been. A guy was passing me to get to his seat in the row, and he just held up a joint right to my face, and he asked me if I wanted to hit it. I didn't. I was
smart kid.
Again, yeah, I was pretty. I'm still very cautious generally, as we mentioned before, protective of my wherewithal. And I said no, and he went, "All right, well, have a good show." I'm like, that's so polite. Right. I had that thought, like, what a nice guy he is.
Really inappropriate, but also kind of polite.
But in the best way possible. So there was that. But I remember that first night, I had been to Madison Square Garden before. I'd seen Knicks games and Rangers games. And when I was really little, like Barnum and Bailey's Circus. So I was familiar with the building. I was familiar with navigating through Penn Station and getting up to Madison Square Garden. Like that wasn't a big deal. My parents, actually, we talked a little bit earlier about how permissive they were. They let me sometimes just wander around Greenwich Village with a couple of my friends to buy bootleg tapes and go into the old CD shops and get like pizza or coffee or whatever. Like I was allowed to just go to New York City for an afternoon to kill time.
That's
at like
incredible.
13 and 14 years old. So I wasn't intimidated by going to a show by myself, but I remember I knew Crossroads, I knew Golgi Apparatus, I knew Fluffhead, pretty much anything off Junta or off a Picture of Nectar that they played, I knew very well. Otherwise, I wasn't that familiar. They also played during Possum Can't Turn You Loose by Otis Redding, the Blues Brothers theme. And my friend Danny was having a big obsession with the Blues Brothers at that time. So I thought that was really fun that I knew that song and Danny wasn't there. So my friend Craig and I, who were together, the three of us were good friends. Danny chose not to go. And we were so happy because that meant we could make fun of him when we got home, that they played, that Phish played the Blues Brothers and you weren't there to see it.
I remember the first time I heard them play that. I'm not sure what show it was, but I knew it was familiar, but didn't instantly place it as the Blues Brothers. But it seemed, so precomposed, it just blew me away in the moment. So the fact that you actually knew what was going on, you were a heady little 15-year-old Long Islander.
Yeah, well, when you go from Billy Joel to The Who to Phish, you really experienced a lot. But yeah. It was because even before Phish, I was going to Dave Matthews Band concerts by myself at Jones Beach. And yes, that was very polished and that wasn't really, they were very radio and pop friendly. That was Crash, Into Me and Ants Marching and that era of their career. I still think they were some of the best musicians I've ever seen perform live. And that was a little bit cleaner of a show than Phish was. But I still exposed myself to any sort of music I could hear. Because once The Who opened the door, that led to every classic rock band ever, whether it's the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, name it. And then that led me to older blues and then mid 70s progressive rock, maybe like Jethro Tull and Rush and stuff like that. So it was it was Pandora before Pandora, basically. It was the algorithm of life exposing me. And Phish did a great job of telling me, you don't have to like this kind of music because we play everything. And so I grew very large ears.
Yeah. I think people on the outside would say, oh, all he does is listen to Phish. And we know, of course, that's not true. If you're a big enough music fan to be a Phish fan, you're listening to lots of other things. But I mean, if you were going to pick one specific band to listen to, you're covering a lot of your musical genres and musical bases, by listening to Phish shows across the years, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're kind of like, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to make this, they're kind of like a Quentin Tarantino of music, where they kind of borrow from all different kinds of genres and inspirations from the past, package it in their own presentation, where it's very transparent, where you see how they were inspired. And you can make the argument, as many have about Phish and about Quentin Tarantino, that it's unoriginal, that it's just repackaged. But it's new to you. And so it kind of puts that inspiration into the listener on a good day to kind of research, where did this come from? And if you do it right, it leads you down the right path, which makes you appreciate both the original and the new package at the same time.
And something I think of more and more looking back is how against the stream Phish was swimming with respect to what was popular in the early 90s, but especially in the mid 90s and the late 90s. I mean, you think about all of the heavy, serious kind of grunge rock, of course, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, early 90s, but then things got, in 1999, it was like Limp Bizkit and Stained and all, like stuff that was pretty self-serious. And then you have Phish doing their goofy things.
Cheesecake. Yeah.
I was explaining that to my wife the other night for the first time. She was like, wait, what? Cheesecake?
Yeah.
It's like,
all of Phish is an inside joke. That's the bane of their career. Everything is funny only to them and people who know about it. And that's it.
right. It's weird to everybody else.
Yeah.
Kind of annoying. What is and I'm sure you've talked about this on the podcast, but what are your attendance bias shows and why?
Well, definitely that Nashville show that I just talked about. So I'm not going to go over that again, but otherwise probably October 8th, 99 or October 7th, 99, which were a pair of shows at the Nassau Coliseum. And the reasons why is, number one, it was so close to my house. My friends and I, by this point, so this is almost 2 years after I first saw them, rather than my one friend who also liked Phish, we now found like 3 more friends who liked Phish. So now we were a big group of 5. So our high school, our last period ended at 2:05, which is very early now. Even as a teacher, I know that. So we're done at 2:05. We all went home, changed our shirts, whatever. And we were at the Coliseum at like 2:40 because we lived so close, and we got in line. We all had GA tickets. We didn't realize that this was a big deal at the time. We all had GA tickets and we lined up right away. We spent no time at all in the lots, and we got front row to both of those shows right in front of Paige, both nights. I still have the wristbands for them. And again, this was part of my honeymoon period where everything they played was perfect and not only perfect, but a masterpiece. And and I talked about this on one of my mini episodes on the show, but on the second night, on the 8th, Tom Marshall came out and he sang "We're Not Gonna Take It" from Tommy. So this was everything I was wearing my Keith Moon shirt, no less, which I still have. So it really was kind of this passing of the baton, or this melding of, this is my favorite band being played by my other favorite band. I knew that they covered Quadrophenia and they play Sparks occasionally, but other than those things, their melding with Phish and The Who isn't that tight. But when I saw that, so number one, I was front row. Number two, it was my home venue. Number three, it was my favorite band playing my other favorite band. Number four, it was a guest star. Number five, I was with a bunch of my friends. So it was like everything came together for that perfect night.
And number six, you knew that 22 years later, you were going to do a guest hosting episode 6 on Phish recaps. And you would talk about the night prior, but hey, still close enough that you knew it was a special show.
But the night prior was also extremely special, musically speaking. The 8th was kind of the more fun night, but the 7th was much better musically, I would argue. And even more than that, 25 years, 22 years?
22 years, yes.
When I had Tom Marshall on Attendance Bias, I didn't speak to him about it during the show, but off mic, I asked him about that night. And he said to me, "You may not have noticed this, but I was in like pajama pants and I was barefoot because I was supposed to come on for the encore, but they called me on toward the middle of the second set and I had no idea I was about to go on stage."
Oh man, that's nuts. I remember seeing him and his daughter come on stage at Hershey in 2000, September 15th. And, then fast forward 19, 20 years, and he's talking with his daughter on his podcast, Under the Scales. And it's like, oh yeah, no, she's grown up. She's like 20 something and out of college. And, this little girl, literally like a little 4 or 5, 6-year-old girl is now all grown up. So just really covering the decades with Phish in every possible way. You had also alluded to 8/4, 2015. I remember seeing the Atlanta run, which I know was July 31st and August 1st. So remind me which show August 4th, 2015 is.
August 4th is the Nashville show.
Oh, nice. Well, yeah, and that's funny because they played 2 nights in Atlanta. Then they played in Tuscaloosa, and then they came to Nashville, and I had to work and I couldn't swing the Tuscaloosa show. So naturally I was concerned that was going to be like a game hinge bust out or something. And as I recall, of the 4 shows, Tuscaloosa was the one that was, slightly missable. So, okay, gotcha. It worked out. You picked a good one to come to then down in Nashville. Well, you've talked to a lot of people about, attendance bias and why like certain shows that others might say, yeah, that was a fun show. I was there. So you've talked to enough people. Like, I mean, do you have any insights as to like what is the tie that binds all of these disparate shows together? Does it come down to me and my high school buddies were in the first row, page side, rage side? I mean, how much of it is that versus is there something else like ethereal or magical kind of happening?
I think a lot of it is first shows. I think a lot of it is novelty. I think a lot of people, myself included, attach sentimental value to the first time you see X, whether it's the band as a whole or the first time you've seen a song. Like when I spoke to, I think it was Elisa Alashant from Phish Radio, she caught Sneakin' Sally Through the Alley for the first time after seeing them for 22 years. And we talked about that whole show, but to her, that was kind of the heart of it. So I think firsts and novelties are really the big, like, number one reason. Family and friends, definitely number two. I've loved the times where I've spoken to, there was one episode where it was a father and son that I spoke to about a show at the Gorge. And that was extremely meaningful, even to me. I didn't even meet these people face to face, but it was such a heartwarming and enjoyable conversation. So family and friends, novelty and first times. And I don't know, sometimes it's just a good story. A couple of recent ones are about family, but also in a different way than like going with your son or your father or whoever. A lot of them, it's like tribute songs where recently a guest talked about how he and a friend who had recently passed away, they used to go to Phish shows all the time. And this guy after his friend died of an overdose, he made like a promise to himself. He's going to hit every show to see Lizards because that was like a really enjoyable song to both this guy and his friend. And so he wanted to make sure he was there for Lizards. And his friend always did this goofy little dance that didn't mean anything, other than his own amusement. And the guest gave his phone to whoever he was with, and he said, "Here, record me. I'm going to do this guy Cadillac." That was the name of the friend, Cadillac Ron, who was a battle rapper in LA. And he said, "I'm going to do Cadillac's dance for the encore, whatever it is." And he started doing the silly dance, and they started playing Lizards.
Oh, God.
And he had been chasing it for years and years. And so sometimes it's just serendipity. Sometimes it's just a really good story.
Yeah, that's really one of the special things about your podcast and the stories that, you help people tell is I might read the description and so picks a show from 2018. And in my head, I'm thinking, all right, what's so special about this? But then when you spend the time and you listen to their story, you almost always come around with a deep appreciation for, their unique relationship with the band and whatever went down on that specific night.
Yeah. And there's even, sometimes it's just a fun story, even if the show isn't very good. One guest talked about the band's Amsterdam show in 1996, which is pretty widely regarded as one of the worst performances they've ever done, Coventry excluded, because they were just too fucked up. They just, no song finished. And They said they were going to come back on for a third set. And they did. It lasted like 30 minutes, but nothing ever came together, really, the whole length of the show. And it was just a cool story to hear about what it was like to see Phish in Amsterdam in the mid-90s when weed in America was still very taboo. And it was still, no one was really not talking about it because Normal was around then, but no government was talking about legalization or decriminalization. So to hear just that lens for fans who are now 20 or 25 years old, they were born in 1996.
Yeah.
So to even look at it that way is a good story in itself for the audience.
Yeah. A lot of things have changed quite a bit.
No phones.
Over the eras. Yeah. No phones. God, I remember going to, and I talked to you about this show when I was on going to Star Lake in 2000. We had to pull over at a gas station and call our home and ask someone to look up a direction because we didn't have the right atlas in the glove compartment. And we didn't remember exactly how to get there, even though we as very clever 19-year-olds thought that we would, of course, remember. So yeah, a different era to be sure. putting a podcast together, it's takes work. It's not the easiest thing, even though we all have podcasts now post-pandemic. We all develop these hobbies, but it is a craft, I think, and almost, like listening to Phish, part of the enjoyment is just the process itself. How do you get the ideas for, a new episode of Attendance Bias? What's your favorite part of putting it together? Can you just talk a little bit about the process, since you've put together a crap ton of them in the last year?
The best part about coming up with ideas is I don't have to. The guest does it.
Nice.
For ideas for the podcast, it's what's one show or jam that's meaningful to you? Well, what does meaningful mean to you? And you do the rest. And then for me, it's once they come up with a jam or a show, we agree on it. And then it's my job. I listen to the show or the jam as much as possible. I take a lot of notes. I usually listen to the show. If it's a full show, I usually listen to it 2 or 3 times. If it's a jam, usually much more than that because it's less time consuming. I start a Google Doc of notes that I share with the guest. I write out kind of like a stream of consciousness of me listening. That person, the guest, adds his or her thoughts on it. And then we record. We don't read the notes necessarily, but we kind of use them as an outline or a jumping off point.
It is exciting when someone says, here's a show that means something to me. And that's kind of like, your automatic entry point. It's almost like someone says, oh, hey, I have this free ticket for this thing. Do you want to come with? And all of a sudden you're like, yeah, sure. Why not? Yeah. I don't have any expectations. So that's kind of exciting. What's a challenging part of putting together Attendance Bias? Because again, I'm very impressed at how you are cranking these out. I can sense that you are a responsible, conscientious sort of young man. You're not going to shirk any responsibilities here, but it does take some work. And, I would imagine that there are at least a few minor trials and tribulations along the way.
The biggest challenge that I face is scheduling and following up with people who reach out to me, because I get a lot of messages from people all over the place, whether it's a direct message on phish.net or Twitter or Facebook or email. Hey, I have a great show, or I have a great story about, September 29th, 99 at the Pyramid. I'd love to talk about it. And it's very hard for me to say no. And so I'll say, sure, I'll get back to you. And then more often than not, I don't. So I would like to take this opportunity to apologize to anyone in the world who I told you I would get back to you and I haven't yet. But it's hard for me. Again. Yeah, I just kick my butt a little bit. It's hard for me to keep on track of how many outlets I have, because there's so many ways to be contacted in the digital world. And it's hard for me to keep track of who contacted me when and what story they wanted to tell. And so I just lose track. And more often than not, I just go when some time clears up. The most recent person who contacted me, I get back to them. I take the path of least resistance.
Well, and I've always been impressed with our interactions because you are punctual and you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. So, I know that's something that I've definitely appreciated.
Well, once I start, like once we agree on a show, like you and I, and once I get started on the notes for it, I'm not letting that go, because it's like catching a tiger by the tail. I'm not letting that go because I've already put time into it. And there's nothing I like less than wasted time.
And how are you keeping motivated? Is it the process? Do you have some end goal in mind? What is making the engine tick here?
Talking about Phish.
Nice.
That's really it. What is it? As an English teacher, one of the oldest cliches is write what you know. In the podcast, it's talk about what you know. When we talk about our fandom in 1.0, when I was absorbing and just soaking up, and I name checked these before, but the Phish Compendium by Dean Budnick and the Farmer's Almanac with like 10 editors, and rec.music.phish and the Phish Bowl on AOL and the chats there. I was just soaking up and learning so much information, but had limited means to express it because I didn't have a lot of friends, still don't, at least in person, who are into Phish. So I need to find people who are, and it's an outlet.
And that's really the incredible thing about the time and era in which we live, because I was the same way. mentioned going to, 99, a show in the summer with a handful of high school friends. They weren't really into Phish. They just knew that Phish was a good time. I don't even talk to any of those friends anymore and haven't, since like the next summer. But the fact that, you and I can sort of hang out virtually and talk about Phish, and we can share some tweets back and forth about shows and jams. I think it's really cool because this is kind of, even though we're all clawing over each other to get tickets for shows, this is kind of a niche hobby that we have committed ourselves to. So it is nice to share that experience.
Yeah, that's really what it comes down to. I mean, the world becomes very small online in a certain niche.
Do you have any dream guests on Attendance Bias? You've talked to Zizix. You've talked to Tom Marshall. No, you got to talk to me. That must have been really special. Who are you sort of maybe hoping and thinking about?
One of the last things I did before I was ready to launch was I made an Excel spreadsheet, because that's the limits of my technical ability, Microsoft Excel, with the file name Attendance Bias Guest Wish List. And some names on it, it's like 100 long, but some names are Andy Gadiel, Katie Tur of MSNBC, Jake Sherman.
Nice.
Scott Bernstein, who runs Yemblog, I think, right?
Yeah.
Abby Jacobson, formerly of Broad City.
Yeah.
Rocco Baldelli, the former Tampa Bay Devil Ray and current manager of the Minnesota Twins.
He follows me on Twitter.
Oh yeah, yo, send it out. Tag him when we do this. Maybe not during baseball season, but Sean Doolittle, who is a pitcher for the Washington Nationals, who on his glove has "Punch You in the Eye" stitched in.
Yeah, the list of baseball, coaches and players that I root for is pretty short, and it all ties back to Phish fandom. It's basically Rocco Baldelli and Sean Doolittle. Yeah,
and so I have a lot more on there. Fred Savage is on there as well. I've heard nothing confirmed, but I've heard that he's a fan. Dan Cantor, who is formerly, I think, Justin Bieber's musical director.
Right.
Because he seems very outgoing, but he's very hard to get in touch with. Being associated with Justin Bieber on social media, he has like unlimited followers.
Right.
So, the more well-known a person is, the more layers there are between them and the public. But that would be great, because I feel like these big names like Katie Tur or Abby Jacobson or Tom Marshall, for that matter, when we talk about Phish, we're all in the same playing field. Because we're all fans. I'm not intimidated by any other fan.
Right. It's the ultimate leveling experience. Yeah. What do Danny DeVito, Fred Savage, and Abby Jacobson have in common?
Right. Well, I know Danny DeVito was at Coventry. What I've heard is that he was there for his son. That I don't know if he's a fan, but I don't know. My first question will be, when is Twins 2 coming out?
Yeah. Does Arnold like Phish?
Yeah. Can you imagine?
Well, you live in New York City. You've talked about growing up on Long Island, which now I'm jealous. I didn't grow up on Long Island. I mean,
don't be jealous.
15 minutes from Nassau, 15 minutes from Jones Beach, 45 minutes from Manhattan, Madison Square Garden.
Well, that's where I grew up. It's a very Long Island. It's not a misnomer. So you might not be that close depending on where you live, just for geography's sake.
That's true. Well, maybe you could take the chopper if you live out in the Hamptons. Or,
true. Yeah. Get on with Howard Stern. You get right to the garden.
Yeah. But were you just seeing music left and right, like during the hiatus or in between these like deep dives into Phish? How has, living in New York City been for you as a musical fan, like away from Phish? During
the hiatus, 100%, or the breakup, more like 1,000%, because at that time there was someone playing somewhere every night of the week for $30 or less. And I could make a list a mile long of bands like String Cheese Incident, Robert Randolph and the Family Band, Mo, Disco Biscuits, Umphreys, Tea Leaf Green, Dark Star Orchestra, Medeski Martin and Wood, Bela Fleck, Ben Harper. Like, you could just go down the line, and respect to all these bands. but they're not Phish. Like, you don't have to pay $70 in Madison Square Garden to see them. They're at the PlayStation Theater. They're at the Lion's Den. They're at the Hammerstein Ballroom or Irving Plaza. Like, these small to mid-sized venues where there's really not security, because they're really nightclubs, that you walk in, you see the band, you walk out, you could get tickets like the day of. And so in that point of my life, I was seeing more music almost every night than I ever had. The Wetlands was still around. So it wasn't hard to do that. More recently, though, since I have, and you know all about this, waking up very early in the morning for my job. I mean, for me, getting up, the time I get up is probably your lunchtime. You know, you get up super early, I know.
Well, when does your alarm go off?
5:45.
I always joke that anything before like 8 o'clock qualifies as early. Although, when my dumb alarm goes off at like 1:50 in the morning, which
that's insane.
It will do after the first night of the Halloween run here coming up, and I will be at work a couple hours, after coming home. But we do what we have to do, and I wouldn't do that for Dark Star
no, I didn't at the time. That's the thing. Like, I was in my early 20s. I was in grad school, so I was also doing like part-time jobs to balance it out. And part-time jobs like retail, you didn't have to be as prepared for that as I do now, being in front of 30 12-year-olds at 7:50 in the morning to teach them what a simile is. That's hard. But nowadays, I usually I see live music usually in one big block. Like, I'll save up to see Roger Waters on a Friday night, rather than for that same money could probably send me to probably a dozen small shows spread out throughout a month. Or I don't know, it's more like feast or famine these days, where, whether it's Roger Waters or Willie Nelson, or this summer I'm seeing Wilco and My Morning Jacket, because there's a venue like 10 minutes, not even 10 minutes from my house in Forest Hills. It's a 10,000 person small tennis stadium in Forest Hills. And the best part of it is my Forest Hills, where I live, is a very residential area. So it's part of the agreement with the venue that all the shows have to end at 10 o'clock, the latest.
Right. Not a bad
I love it.
thing when you're a working stiff like we are, that's for sure.
Right. But I'll save up for shows like that more so than go and see maybe 2 shows every 2 months or 3 months, rather than seeing a show every night for like $12 cover.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. We're all doing that, unstoppable march into middle age here, and we got to pick our spots. So that makes good sense. Anything else that you wanted to chat about with respect to attendance bias? Just as one of your, enthusiastic fans, it's a fun listen. It's really nice to hear people's stories about jams and about shows. And, this is one big community. I've always been, and I feel like you probably have too, I've always been in it more for the music than necessarily for the deep network of friendship. But that is kind of the silver lining for me, is that on top of this music that you can just go deeper and deeper and deeper into, there is this whole cast of characters and group of friends waiting to be met that you can kind of enjoy along the ride. Yeah,
it kind of comes as a side effect, isn't the right word, but a perk, I guess, is really the way to look at it. It's really a blessing. It's really a great thing that people feel so connected just by hearing me talk to other people about Phish, about the best thing in the world, and hearing their stories. That doesn't, I want to always get in touch, always reach out. At the very least, I'll write back and say, thanks so much for listening. Do you want a sticker? At the very least, that's what I'll do. If I had anything to say, it would be, again, I'm sorry to anyone who I've teased about coming on the show and haven't followed up. So I really don't do it out of disinterest. It's just, I get overwhelmed sometimes between the time it takes to put an episode together and then real life on the side, by the way,
right.
that it's, I just don't know. I'm not always able to keep track of who contacted me where, about what, when. So I do want to apologize for everyone who's reached out to me that I've said I'm interested and hadn't followed back up.
Hey, as someone who listens to your podcast regularly, I'm gonna send you a note if in a couple more months I don't hear any of those kind of guests. So I'll keep you accountable.
Thank you.
But well, hey, thanks for the chat, Brian. Love what you do. Love your enthusiasm and your dedication. So also, it's nice of you to sort of peel the curtain back a little bit. I don't even know how many hours I've spent listening to you talk with other people about Phish. All time well spent, but it's kind of nice to take a slightly deeper dive into the process. So appreciate you.
Thank you. And hopefully I'll see you next year. We do this again in about a year's time.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Sounds like a great plan. And congrats on the podcast. It's amazing.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Justin. And that's it for today's interview with me, Brian Weinstein, with Justin Bruce as today's guest host. Now, if you added up all the information that I've discussed with our multitude of guests over the course of the past year, I still don't think that we would have enough information to double check and fact check as we did today. So it's going to be time now for a very extensive attendance bias fact check.
Attendance bias fact check.
First, for all of you Billy Joel fans out there, all four of you, the River of Dreams show at Madison Square Garden that I saw with my family that changed my life was on October 12th, 1993. Another calendar check. I mentioned that my parents were very permissible about letting me go to concerts with my friends at a young age. As an example, I brought up Stone Temple Pilots with the Meat Puppets at Jones Beach with my friend Tim. That was part of Stone Temple Pilots' Purple Tour. After a little bit of research, I found out that show was played on August 25th, 1994. That means I was 12 years old at the time and days away from starting 7th grade. I guessed that A Picture of Nectar is 17 tracks, but I was off by one. The album is actually 16 tracks. I guessed that driving from Buffalo to Cincinnati takes about 7 hours, and I just checked on Google Maps. It says that it's 6 hours and 36 minutes, but please remember, this was during February of 2003, so take that 6.5 hours, throw in some February weather in the Midwest and around Lake Erie. I'm pretty confident in rounding that up to a solid 7 hours. When discussing the time leading up to Phish's return in 2009, I mentioned that there were several breadcrumbs or rumors that stoked the fanbase's excitement for a possible return in 2008. One of these was a brief reunion at Brad Sands' wedding. I was right about that. This happened on September 6, 2008, just about a month before the official return was announced. At this wedding, the four members of Phish reunited for their former road manager's wedding to play Susie Greenberg, Julius, and Waste. In that same portion of the interview, I quoted or mentioned a Trey Anastasio interview from Rolling Stone. The article is titled, "Trey Anastasio Hints at Phish Reunion." It was written by Brian Hyatt and was published on May 28, 2008. The full quote reads, "When Phish broke up, I made some comment about how I'm not going to go around playing You Enjoy Myself for the rest of my life," Anastasio said with a laugh. "Phish and Mike and Paige have been talking to each other a lot lately, and now... It's not that I can't believe that I said that, but it's symbolic of how much I lost my mind or how much I lost my bearings or something. Because at this point in time, I would give my left nut to play that song 5 times in a row every day until I die." I think I could speak for the fan base to say thank goodness Trey didn't have to go that far and that they are still around and playing. Justin told a cool story about hearing Phish practice I Always Wanted It This Way in Nashville, although they wouldn't debut it until a few days later. The song officially debuted live on October 15th, 2016 at the North Charleston Coliseum, a show I was at, and I love that song right from the start. When discussing Big Boat and the band's performance of Petrichor on New Year's Eve 2016, I offhandedly said that I didn't enjoy set 3 because, quote, they played a lot of Big Boat songs after that. Turns out that set looms larger in my mind than actually happened in reality, because the band played just 3 songs off the album during that set after Petrichor. They played No Men in No Man's Land, Breath and Burning, and Tide Turns. For the record, the Bach piece that Trey teases during the intro of the Cincinnati 2001 is Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. You've probably heard it if you've ever been to a wedding. When talking about different reasons for people's attendance bias, I mentioned a number of guests and shows. Here's a quick rundown to the guests that were referenced and their respective shows that they chose for the attendance bias episode. Elisa Alashant spoke on attendance bias about seeing Sneakin' Sally Through the Alley for the first time at November 2nd, 2018. The father and son duo that I referenced were Ben and Jeff Fortgang, who came on the show to talk about their family and musical bonds, as well as July 15th, 2016 at the Gorge. The episode about lizards and Cadillac Ron was with actor Luke LaGraff. He spoke about the band's performance of Lizards from July 25th, 2018 at the Bill Graham Civic Auditorium in San Francisco. And finally, the episode about Phish's lackluster performance in Amsterdam was with Jeff Somar, and the Phish show was played on July 12th, 1996 at the Melkweg in Amsterdam. And that's it for today's special episode of Attendance Bias, celebrating our 1-year anniversary. I want to take a minute to thank every single one of you for even listening once, listening twice, or subscribing and being a part of the show since its very beginning. I couldn't do it without you. Please continue to listen to the show and spread the word to your friends. Thank you so much. And if you really do enjoy Attendance Bias, please leave a rating and a review on whatever podcast you use to listen. Finally, you could find Attendance Bias on social media, specifically on Instagram and Twitter. If you follow, reach out and I'll send you a free sticker. Thank you again so much for participating, for listening, and being a part. And I'll see you next week on Attendance Bias.